Welcome to this lecturette on culture. In this lecturette, we'll be looking at two key questions. First, what is culture? And second, what are the two schools of culture? Culture as a term itself is highly contested. This means that the word culture is claimed by and defined by many different academic disciplines such as biology, medical science, anthropology, sociology, and our field, communication. There is no one understanding of what the word culture means, what it defines. So culture is an extremely complicated term that is up for debate depending on which discipline you're coming from. In communication, we tend to look at culture in two different ways, either as a tool or as when we're talking about a totality of processes. The word culture comes from Latin colere, which means inhabit, cultivate, protect, and honor with worship. It also comes from cultera, which primarily means husbandry, that is, the tending of crops or animals. It's not something we usually think of when we talk about the word culture. The use of the word culture, as we understand it today, developed from a metaphor. So, using the word culture in terms of husbandry as a metaphor for human development. So today when we talk about culture, we tend to refer to culture as a system of shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, and artifacts that members of society use to cope with their world and with one another. And these are transmitted from one generation to another through learning. So that's a very important way of thinking about culture. It is the way we think and how we deal with the world and each other, and also what we give to the people coming up, and is particularly something that's done through learning. So that is generically what we talk about when we talk about culture. In terms of culture, there are really two schools of culture, the idealist school and the materialist school. Now, the idealist school, to summarize, would say that culture is the best that has been said and thought in the world. Now, the idealist school tends to assume that the values of culture exist in an abstract and are the same for all human societies, meaning that if one were to say this is the best that's been said and thought in one particular culture, the assumption will be that this would apply to all other cultures. Idealist culture believes that the world would be a much better place if more people will share and pursue these notions of beauty, truth, and perfection, that is, of culture. The idealist school looks at culture as being the high point of civilization, but also something that can be used to civilize the masses. It tends to be institutionalized, that means be located in specific institutions such as the university or various organizations or locations, as well as class-based, as idealist culture tends to assume that I suppose higher activities that would be traditionally associated with the upper classes such as ballet and opera would be the high point of culture as opposed to, let's say, rock and roll or rap music. Idealist culture tends to focus on the aesthetic quality of beauty, goodness, and value, and it tends to associate these three with each other, that something beautiful would be good and highly valued. And it is positioned quite explicitly against the mass culture of industrialization. So it says that the high point of culture, the culture itself, is something that is special, that rises above, and is definitely not part of mass culture. Now, on the other hand, the materialist school tends to look at culture from a very different perspective. Raymond Williams says that culture is ordinary in every society and in every mind. He says that culture is about lived daily practices, the norms and symbols and values of what we do. What's interesting about the materialist school of culture is that it acknowledges working class cultural practices. So culture is no longer something that is owned by or belongs to only the upper classes. As such, this means that this approach to culture makes culture extremely democratic and inclusive of all the different types of people that might engage in it. And this changes quite dramatically traditional ways of conceptualizing culture from being the best that's been said and thought and something that's institutionalized and owned by the upper classes to something that's very ordinary and it's everyday, and it acknowledges that it comes from all types of people, different classes, and is democratic and includes everybody else. Now, importantly, the materialist culture then talks about cultures having two aspects: known meanings and directions, to which its members are trained; new observations and meanings, which are offered and tested. So there's two elements here: things that we already know and things that we then learn and that are that are then tested. Which means, at one level, there's a shared meaning. We all have a certain cultural literacy and understanding of certain cultural codes. So we know what things are being said from the culture in which we exist. The meaning is shared between all the different people that exist in that culture. The other element is contested meanings, where new observations or meanings are put into the mix, new ways of talking about something, or new forms of culture, or new ways of thinking about things, and this is then contested and tested within that culture. As such, culture is constantly in a state of flux, which means you cannot fix culture to one object or one entity. As such, culture is both traditional and yet creative. Now, the two schools are not something that you would compare ideally, because that sets off the whole debate around binary structures. But just as a form of convenience, if we think about the two schools, idealist culture tends to focus on high and low culture, which is high culture is good and low culture is crass and banal, whereas the materialist school says culture is daily and ordinary. The idealists put culture as something that belongs to and is exercised by a minority. As such, it creates a stratification and a sense of privilege, whereas the materialists looked at culture as something that belongs to a majority, so such as sport. The idealists say culture is exclusive, and the materialists say culture is inclusive. And this also is useful in terms about thinking who engages in cultural practices and who gets to define culture. Now, if culture is exclusive, it is by definition then limited, versus culture that's inclusive, includes a lot of different people and different classes. That type of culture is highly varied. Now, but idealist culture tends to focus on aesthetic quality, where materialist culture focuses on social relations, which means it focuses on the interactions between people. It doesn't value the culture for the way the culture looks, the way the culture sounds, or where the culture is located, but it focuses more on how culture is managed between different people interacting. As such, it tries to look at culture from a far more total perspective rather than a narrow-casted perspective as in idealist culture. And importantly, idealist culture looks at culture as being universalistic. That means that if something is considered the best in one culture, it would naturally transpose and carry into other cultures. Whereas the materialists believe that culture is localized, and different locales have different types and different values of culture. So this brings us back to thinking about what is culture. Raymond Williams talks about culture in two senses: to mean a whole way of life, the common meanings to mean the arts and processes, the arts and learning, and the special processes of discovery and creative effort. That's really important. So culture both has a fixed and flexible meaning. We have a shared code and way of engaging with each other through common meanings, but it's also about creating new ways of thinking and new forms of culture through discovery and creative effort. And finally, it's very important to remember that culture is communication and communication is culture, and to disembed each from the other is almost impossible and quite counterproductive. So, other questions to consider after the lecture. Using the examples, explain the difference between the two schools of culture, and what are the literacies that you have as evidenced in your everyday cultural practices. Thank you for listening, and this is the end.